Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue our discussion of imperialism in China, when the Qing dynasty tries to react to the Treaty of Nanjing and many of the foreign incursions that have plagued them since really the beginning of the 1800s. We're going to look at attempts to reform Chinese society and the extent to which all of that has happened. So we'll talk a little bit about the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, the Tongzhi Restoration, and the Yizhitian movement, and how this sort of affected both the way that Chinese reacted to foreigners and the way that Chinese viewed themselves and their government. So let's dive in and talk about some of the problems with China. These problems are not new ones, and none of these problems are things that are unique to the Qing dynasty, but they are things that were starting to reach a breaking point at this point. For example, Chinese landlords had been consolidating significant amounts of land, bringing in new sort of agricultural techniques, and really exploiting the peasantry. So, because of this, much of the land was held by Chinese landlords, and most Chinese peasants were forced to work the land with really very little control over their daily lives, their daily income. Most of the wealth would go to the landlords. They would often have to pay exorbitant prices for food or working or any farm equipment. And so, this exploitive system was creating pretty significant unrest in lots of parts of China, especially as the landlords often increased rents on these tenants and exploited them to the extent that they could. Government officials were supposed to hold all of this in check. The balance was supposed to be of everyone knows that landlords are going to try to exploit the peasantry. But a magistrate, their goal is to keep the peasantry relatively happy. And so the goal of a magistrate is to restrain the landlords to the extent that they don't exploit the peasantry to the point that it disrupts production. Because what the central government wants from these government officials is to be able to make sure that revenue and taxes keep flowing into the central treasury. And one of the things that really disrupts taxes is a massive peasant rebellion. And so these government officials, these mandarins, they've of course passed the imperial examination system and have moved up the bureaucracy to become regional governors. And so it's their job to restrain the landlords and prevent them from leading to peasant unrest. The problem with this, unfortunately, is over time, the goals and the expectations on magistrates are significantly larger than the magistrates are actually prepared to do. Most of the exams focused on the whole eight-tailed essay thing. It was a type of writing that focused much more on form and knowledge of Confucian classics. And in traditional Chinese society, your ability to write and understand Confucian classics really demonstrated your overall education and your suitability for office. But in this much more complicated world that China is morphing into, your ability to write a very specific essay form doesn't necessarily prepare you for dealing with, modern agricultural techniques, for reforms, for putting down, or appeasing peasant rebels, from balancing the interests of landlords with the interests of local people. And so there was a push to reform the imperial examination system and to put magistrates in place who were less corrupt and more effective, because magistrates were expected to take bribes as part of their salary, as part of their payment. But over time, and so the idea is if a region is profitable, then the magistrate would get more in bribes. But over time, this system started breaking down and peasant unrest kept growing. These gangji payments, these sort of thank you payments to government officials, again, are supposed to then be used to help build, flood control and other public works. They're supposed to be used to maintain roads, with the idea that, again, the landlords giving these payments have interest in this happening. But over time, corruption grew, natural disasters increased, a drought and then rainy seasons led to flooding and led to significant peasant unrest. All of this led to the massive Nian Rebellion, which happened right in the mid 1800s, with the slogan "Kill the officials, kill the rich, spare the poor." And so, although the Nian rebels were not particularly successful, they were a sort of northern rebel group right up here along the Yellow River Valley. Although the Neon rebels were not overly successful in their goals, we're starting to see anti government, anti wealthy forces growing in China, with the understanding that if someone could come in and sort of mobilize these forces and direct them, they could really have a chance to topple the Qing dynasty and potentially usher in a new Chinese golden age. And so there's a real sense that the Qing dynasty is starting to weaken and starting to lose the mandate of heaven. The guy who did this is Hong Xiuquan, who was a failed imperial exam candidate. He took the imperial exam 3 times and failed it 3 times, and after this decided that basically he would rather try to overthrow the dynasty as opposed to work within it. He was able to gain a massive following of peasants who were dissatisfied with the status quo. He also used a new religious movement that he founded, where he proclaimed that he was the Son of God and the brother of Jesus, and had been sent down by God to usher in the new era of the, quote, Taiping heavenly kingdom. And so Hong and his army mobilized and then marched on the southern capital of Nanjing, and were able to seize and take the capital. Here's Hong Xiuquan's land policy of the Taiping heavenly kingdom. Take a moment, pause, and read it. Hopefully, you can pull out some elements of sort of millennial religious teachings, some elements of socialism here, and of course, the idea of compulsory government military service, to help support his heavenly kingdom. The problem with Hong is, although he was able to take the southern capital, he declared himself the son of heaven and declared his new Taiping heavenly kingdom. Once he took Nanjing, rather than marching on Beijing and ending the Qing dynasty, he just got super paranoid and started cloistering himself away and writing religious texts. And the Taiping heavenly movement kind of burned itself out. This isn't to say that there was an easy process for the Chinese government to take him down, because again, his followers numbered in the millions, and it's possible that the death toll of the Taiping heavenly kingdom was in the tens/hundreds of millions. Records were not kept particularly well as far as who died in this whole movement. But the Qing dynasty did respond. They decided that they needed to create a new modern Western-style army. Hopefully, as you've noticed, this is one of the trends that has happened in a lot of non-Western societies is, at this point, they've realized that European military formations are just quite frankly superior to anything they've been able to put together in the past. They need to bring in new technologies. They need to reorganize their society and their military along Western lines. The main leader of this is Zhang Guofan, who helped to lead and create what's called the ever-victorious army of the Qing dynasty. He brought in European advisors, most famously Charles Chinese, quote-unquote, Gordon, who helped organize this ever-victorious army, this Qing dynasty army, to attempt to put down the Taiping rebels. And they launched a massive assault, driving out the rebels, defeating them, recapturing the city of Nanjing, and reestablishing the military supremacy of the Qing dynasty. We also have Zhou Zhongtang, who I note just simply because he is the namesake for the fabulous American Chinese dish General Tso's chicken, which I really enjoy. After this time period, after both the Nian and the Taiping rebellion, the Qing dynasty decided that reform was necessary. The Tongzhi emperor pushed what's called the self-strengthening movement, mostly due to the influence of Prince Gong and Zhang Guofan, who we've talked about previously. The goal is to build, again, sort of a modern diplomatic system, to actually start sending out ambassadors to Western countries, to really take China into the modern era, to modernize the tax system, to get rid of tax farming, to build modern warships, and start modernizing the education system. Zhang Guofan here lays out basically the advantages of Western methods, so we'll let you read and take that in, and we'll move on. But the basic idea here is that China is not irreparably broken. The Qing dynasty had stagnated China for a long time, but the era in which China could be the sort of the middle kingdom, sort of the center of the world, is really over. And so if you're going to continue to isolate, what's going to happen is you're going to be constantly subjected to foreigners moving in and encroaching on your territory. You're going to have to sign humiliating treaties of Nanjing, and you're going to fall from prominence as a world power. And so Zhang here pushed for some of these changes and attempted to modernize Chinese society. This method of, quote, use the barbarians to defeat the barbarians is sort of a common theme in Chinese history. They've often brought in, it used to be bringing in sort of nomadic tribes people from the northern borders to be used against other northern barbarians. But at this time now, it's bringing in Westerners to teach us how to build railroads, how to build modern cannons and artillery, how to build modern warships, bring in modern science, things like that. So we're going to also bring in new agricultural technologies to modernize that. And he was hoping to, again, use this within the terms of Chinese Confucian education and structures. And so try to graft Western methods onto Chinese society without profoundly changing Chinese society or Chinese culture. The main barrier to reform was the Dowager Empress Shiji. Shiji was the mother of the Tangzhe emperor, and she was not super happy with a lot of these reforms. She was very traditionalist, and she was very concerned about the growing power of Prince Gong and some of these other reformers, and was worried that they would push her out or convince her son to sort of limit her power within the court. And so she is going to, I'll let you read Shiji's response to reform here. She's going to push back strongly against all of this. She's going to extort significant amounts of money and transfer lots of money away, especially from the new Navy program, in order to construct a fabulous marble boat for the palace in Beijing. This is the marble boat constructed by Shiji. And so in order to do this, we had to cut the naval budget pretty substantially. Most famously, they did not have enough gunpowder to actually put in the shells for the modern warships. And so in order to produce these shells without gunpowder, they instead filled them with sand, which is not near as explosive or effective as gunpowder, in order to have enough money to construct this awesome marble boat. Apparently, you can still go see the marble boat. It's still in Beijing, so you can go sort of visit it if you want to. It did not float, unfortunately, so it has to stay constantly moored at the dock, lest it sink to the bottom of the lake. But it was gorgeous, and marble, and a boat, so that's nice. Unfortunately, all of this was tested out in what's known as the First Sino-Japanese War. The First Sino-Japanese War was a battle over the Liaodong Peninsula, right over here, in sort of just north of Korea. And what it revealed to the Chinese is that their ever-victorious army was not prepared to take on a real-world power. Their navy was not prepared to take on a real-world power. We haven't talked about Japanese modernization yet, but that'll be for next lesson. And we'll talk about this war from the Japanese perspective. But the Japanese are able to absolutely crush the Chinese. They're able to take over the island of Formosa, what is today Taiwan. They're able to significantly increase their power in Korea and in the Liaodong Peninsula here. This is also the first example of the Japanese being spectacularly brutal to Chinese prisoners, summary execution being the general rule for the Japanese. And so we're starting to see some really troubling trends within Japanese military culture that, again, we'll talk about a lot more from the Japanese perspective. And the Chinese Beiyang, or Northern Fleet, is going to be absolutely obliterated by the new Japanese Navy. It turns out all of those shells filled with sand were not effective against shells filled with gunpowder. The Japanese Navy obliterates this new Chinese fleet, establishing their naval supremacy in East Asia and demonstrating that the self-strengthening movement had been mostly a failure. At the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Japanese attempted to get control over a significant portion of northern China. They forced China to sign a spectacularly punitive treaty, sort of similar to the Treaty of Nanjing. We're going to get some extraterritoriality in here. We're going to get, some significant parts of China just simply becoming vassals of Japan. But then the Europeans are going to step in and say, actually, Japan, we're not going to let you do that. And so what's called the Triple Intervention pushed in, and European powers, specifically France, Germany, and Russia, stepped in to rewrite the Treaty of Shimonoseki to protect Chinese autonomy within these regions, mostly because the Germans didn't want to lose their holdings within northern China. And this, of course, to some degree protected the Chinese in that it allowed them to be exploited by Europeans and not Japanese. But of course, it outraged the Japanese because they felt like this was their opportunity to get their own sphere of influence in China, and they've been blocked by arrogant Europeans who didn't view them as a true world power. And so we start seeing the beginning of resentment of the Japanese to this European treatment, which is going to become an incredibly important force later. As far as reforms go, we do see the Emperor Guangxu pushing for changes. We see some pretty angry all caps texts here laying out some of the problems that China was facing in the aftermath of the First Sino-Japanese War, the War of Jiawu. So take a moment, read, and we'll move on. Unfortunately, the 100 Days reforms lasted for only approximately 100 days. There was an attempt to push for this, although it mostly failed. In the end, Shiji was still around and ended up locking the Guangxu emperor in his room, preventing him from issuing these orders. All of these sort of reforms mostly failed. We started to see Chinese nationalists like Sun Yat-sen fleeing the country for places like Japan and abroad, lest they be arrested by Shiji's forces. And instead, they're going to double down on sort of Chinese nationalism. The Yehitian movement, or the Boxer Rebellion, was an anti-Western rebellion that ended up being sort of channeled by Shiji to attempt to restore her power. These Boxers were angry about both, exploitation by foreigners, but also bad governmental policy. So instead of really pushing for reforms, Shiji instead encouraged them to go kill the foreigners. Here we see an account of the Boxer Rebellion. So take a moment to pause, read. Unfortunately for China, the Yehitian movement failed. Western forces came in. It was a multinational coalition, including American, French, British, German, Russian, and Japanese forces. These 8 nations then launched a massive assault on Beijing, took the city, drove the Boxers out, protected their Western embassies and their land holdings, and in the end, ended up, despite the fact that it was mostly Japanese troops, the Japanese providing almost half of the suppression force used to put down the Boxers, despite the fact that the Japanese were the main players in this, in the aftermath of the rebellion, the region of Manchuria was instead given to the Russians. They were allowed to build the Russian city of Hardin in northern China, which has some spectacular Russian architecture, despite today being, of course, within the traditional borders of China. The Russians also are going to use this area to build the Trans-Siberian Railway across China, and are going to be are going to connect in their western port of Vladivostok. This, of course, is again going to outrage the Japanese, being a real poke in the eye to the Japanese, who felt like they should be the ones who are taking control of these regions because they're in this sort of the sphere of influence here. And the Liaodong Peninsula is going to be a continued source of contention between these two groups, leading eventually to the Russo-Japanese War, which we'll talk about in a couple lessons. So the takeaway from this, of course, is China did attempt reforms, but for a variety of reasons, this didn't work. And although the Qing dynasty is still around, it is really on its last fumes here. So for next time, we're going to cross the sea over to Japan, talk about the opening up of Japan and their interactions with foreigners, and compare and contrast the reactions and response of the Japanese to these challenges to the responses that we just talked about in China, and look at how that led to very different outcomes for Japan and China in the early part of the 20th century. Thank you for listening.